Welcome back to the deep dive. As we wrap up this exploration together, this feels kind of special, like culminating all these ideas we've been unpacking. You know what I mean? And today we're diving into a real foundational concept, the principle of gender.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's at the heart of this principle, right, is this idea that there are these, we can think of them as masculine and feminine energies present in just about everything. And it's how they work together, how they drive creation, and how important their balance is. That's what we're really looking at here.
Exactly. And like our other dives, we're grounding this one in some specific texts. We've got these excerpts that discuss the principle of gender, and they draw heavily from the Kybalion. But right away, we got to be clear about something. When we say gender in this context, it's not the same as the word sex, like how we usually use it.
Really important distinction there. I mean, we think of sex, we're talking about those biological differences between male and female, right? The physical expression. But gender in this principle, it's a much bigger concept. Go back to that Latin root. It's like to beget, to create, to generate. It's about these underlying creative energies that are driving everything.
Yeah, it's like the principle behind the act of creation itself. Now, just a little side note here, some interpretations. You know, outside the core Hermetic teaching, they kind of tried to twist this principle into some pretty wonky ideas about sex, right? So we're really sticking to the Hermetic perspective as it's presented in our sources.
Agreed, yeah. So our mission today in this deep dive is to understand how this principle of gender is operating on all these different levels of reality, as described in the source material. We're going to look at how these masculine and feminine energies manifest. And we'll start with the basic building blocks of matter and go all the way up to the complexities of the mind.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And let's start with the physical plane. Now, the source we're working with, it acknowledges right up front that like hard scientific proof for this principle, across all its applications, that was still developing when it was written. But it does point to some really cool scientific ideas that were emerging back in the early 1900s.
So, back then, what's interesting is how they thought about the composition of matter itself. They had these fundamental particles, corpuscles they called them, or ions, electrons. And the prevailing idea was that an atom forms from like negative corpuscles clustering around a positive one. And it was this positive element that was seen as like the influence that kind of created the atom.
And here's where the Hermetic teaching comes in. It's so interesting, right? They're saying the masculine principle of gender that was traditionally linked to the positive pole of electricity, and the feminine, well, that was linked to the negative.
But the source makes a really key point about that word negative. They're saying that whole association we have with negative as like weak or unreal, well, it doesn't apply when we're talking about electrical phenomena. Because this so-called negative pole, we often call it the cathode now, right?
No.
That's actually the source of generation. It's where new forms and energies come from. Electrons, cathode rays, all that.
It's not a lack of something. It's about actively generating something. And that's really at the heart of why the text proposes we swap feminine for negative. The generative role of this pole, it aligns perfectly with that feminine principle.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. The text goes on to explain that what they call the latest scientific teachings, at the time they were saying those creative corpuscles, the electrons themselves, they were feminine, composed of what science called negative electricity, which the Hermetic folks are saying, hey, that's feminine energy. So you've got this idea of the feminine as inherently creative at a fundamental level.
So picture this. A feminine corpuscle. It breaks away from a masculine one, but it's not passive. There's a seeking, right? There's an urge to unite with another masculine corpuscle. The text actually uses the word volition, like there's this inherent drive to create new forms of matter, new forms of energy.
And when that union happens, it's not static. You have these feminine particles, and they start vibrating really rapidly under the influence of the masculine energy, moving around it. And then, boom, this results in the birth of a new atom. But that atom, it's its own thing now. It's not exhibiting free electricity anymore. It's a whole new thing.
So what about when those feminine electrons detach? Well, that's ionization,
Sure.
super fundamental process, right? And the key here is that those electrons, those corpuscles, they're seen as the driving force behind all these phenomena. Light, heat, electricity itself, magnetism, attraction and repulsion, even chemical affinity, all arising from this interaction of gender at the energy level.
If you kind of zoom out, take a bigger picture view, right? The masculine principle is presented as directing energy to kickstart creation. And the feminine principle, that's the one actively doing the work of creation across all these different planes. But the source is very clear.
Yeah.
Neither one works alone. They need each other.
And this isn't just happening at the subatomic level. The text reminds us that in organic life, both genders are present within a single organism. Now, granted, the source admits that when it was written, the scientific support for these Hermetic teachings on gender in energy production, it was still limited. But they point to those early scientific observations of sex activity, even in things like crystal formation. It's like a hint,
Yeah.
that there's this more universal principle at play.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, right? Could something as fundamental as gravity even, could that be another manifestation of this principle of gender? Masculine and feminine energies attracting each other. The source admits that hard proof wasn't there yet, but it encourages us to think about it, to consider these different frameworks for understanding the universe.
Okay, so we've looked at how this principle of gender was understood to operate on the physical plane, at least through that early 20th century scientific lens that the source is using. Now, let's shift gears, shall we? Let's dive into how this principle shows up on the mental plane. And this is where things get really interesting with the idea of mental gender.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that the text links this to those duality of mind theories that were popping up in psychology back then. Ideas like, the objective mind versus the subjective mind, the conscious versus the subconscious. And the text is saying the Hermetic perspective, that's actually an ancient understanding of this same duality.
And the correlations they draw are pretty specific. The masculine principle of mind that's linked to the objective, the conscious, the voluntary, the active parts of our mental processes.
And the feminine principle. Well, that's tied to the subjective, the subconscious, the involuntary, and the passive aspects. Now, to be fair, the text does say that the Hermetic teachings, they might not line up perfectly with every detail of, like, later psychological theories, but they're highlighting this basic recognition that there's a dual nature within the mind itself.
Okay, so how did those Hermetic teachers actually guide their students to grasp this idea of mental gender in their own experience? It sounds like self-reflection was a big part of it.
Absolutely. They encourage the student to turn their attention inward, to just observe their own consciousness. And that starting point of awareness is that simple statement, I am. But as you go deeper with that self-inquiry, the text explains that that sense of I am kind of differentiates into two distinct yet unified aspects, the I and the me.
And the me, that's what we usually identify with as our core self, right? It's all our feelings, our likes and dislikes, our habits, our personality. It's the self that we present to the world, the self that others recognize. But, and this is important, it's constantly changing, shaped by those principles of rhythm and polarity. And for a lot of folks, it feels very tied to the body, right? Like it is the body.
Exactly. But then, as we become more self-aware, the text describes this process of separating from that me, realizing that the me isn't the ultimate I. We start to see our mental states, thoughts, emotions, sensations, not as our core self, but as, well, like things. They're produced by our mentality, but they're not the fundamental I.
And this leads to what they call the laying aside process, this growing ability to detach from those mental states, even from our possessions, recognizing they're not really the essence of who we are.
And then, once we start that detachment, the me is revealed in its dual nature. It's described as like a mental womb, capable of creating mental offspring, thoughts, ideas, emotions, fantasies. It's got this inherent creative power, but it needs energy and direction from the I.
Which brings us to the I. This is the part of our mind that can will the me to act, that can observe those mental creations as they're happening. It's the part that projects energy to initiate mental creation. So we've got this analogy. The I is masculine, the me is feminine. The I is being, the me is becoming. It's the principle of correspondence again. As above, so below, playing out right inside our own minds.
Exactly. And this helps us understand the tendencies of each principle on that mental plane. The feminine principle, that's inherently receptive, is taking in impressions from the outside world, from our internal states. The masculine principle, that's expressive, directing energy outward. The feminine, that's generating thoughts, ideas, working with the imagination. The masculine focuses that energy with will.
But the text makes a big point here. For truly original creations, it's got to be that active direction of the masculine will that's leading, not just reacting to the stuff the feminine me is picking up. It's about making conscious choices about our thoughts.
Yeah, and that interplay is super important when we're talking about focused thought. When you're paying attention to something, you're using both principles. The feminine is exploring, generating ideas, and the masculine will is focusing, preventing your mind from wandering off.
It's pretty eye-opening, The text suggests that most people, they're not really using that masculine principle to its full potential. They're living based on thoughts that have been, like, put into their me by outside sources, they're not really taking charge of their own mental space.
And then this idea of mental gender gives us a cool way to look at psychic phenomena too. Telepathy, for instance.
Mm.
The text explains it as that masculine vibratory energy projected from one person to another, and that other person's feminine principle receives that seed and turns it into a thought.
Suggestion and hypnotism, those work in a similar way. It's the focused willpower of the person giving the suggestion directed at the recipient's feminine principle, which tends to just accept it. And the text uses this, and while it's a vivid analogy, it compares it to a cuckoo bird laying its egg in another bird's nest, and then that other bird raises the chick as its own.
It really drives home that image of implanted thoughts, doesn't it? But the ideal, of course, is a state of harmony between the masculine and feminine in our own minds. And the text points out the average person, their masculine principle, their willpower, it's kind of weak. And that makes them easily influenced by other people's minds.
But then the people we consider strong, well, they've developed that masculine will. They have control over their own minds and can even influence others. Those magnetic personalities, actors who evoke strong emotions, persuasive speakers. It's like mental gender in action.
And the text straight up says, that's the secret to personal magnetism, even hypnotism. Suggestion, it all relies on this mental gender and vibration. That's how the objective mind, the masculine, impresses itself on the subjective mind, the feminine.
So the big takeaway, understanding mental gender gives us a new way to look at all sorts of psychological phenomena. It's like a framework for understanding them in a way that's rooted in universal principles, not just random occurrences.
Absolutely. It helps us understand how our own minds work, how we interact with the world, and how we interact with each other on that mental level. It's really powerful stuff.
Okay, so we've explored how the principle of gender operates on the physical plane, on the mental plane, all as laid out in our source material. But now, let's get practical. How can we apply this to our own lives? How can we balance these energies within ourselves?
This is where it gets really exciting, Because all this theory, now we can put it to work for our own growth. And the source material actually gives some really good insights into how to do that, practical steps.
So first, let's just define these energies in a way that's easier to relate to. Masculine energy. That often shows up as action-oriented, logical, decisive, independent, assertive. It's about structure and clarity.
And feminine energy. That tends to be more intuitive, nurturing, receptive, collaborative, empathetic. It's about creativity, emotional intelligence, connection.
So step one, self-reflection. Take a look at your own life. Which energy is more dominant for you? And where do you feel out of balance? Maybe it's your decision-making, maybe it's your emotional connections.
And then the text highlights mindfulness and meditation. Meditation can help you connect to your intuition and emotions, tap into that feminine energy, and even specific breathing exercises like alternate nostril breathing are mentioned as ways to harmonize those brain hemispheres.
Engaging in both logical and creative activities is another big one. Problem solving, planning those cultivate masculine energy, and creative outlets like art, music, writing, even gardening or volunteering, those can foster feminine energy.
Expressing your emotions and practicing empathy are also key. Acknowledging and expressing your feelings, that taps into feminine energy. And active listening, trying to understand others' perspectives, those strengthen those nurturing and connective qualities.
Relationships are important too, right? Recognizing that polarity, those complementary energies that can make for richer relationships. And communication, being open and honest, that's crucial.
Lastly, the source suggests incorporating daily rituals that help integrate these energies. Simple things like movement or dance to connect with your body, connect with your intuition, or heart-centered practices to help unify those energies within you.
It's really about bringing those practices into your life so that you can achieve greater balance between your masculine and feminine energies. And that leads to, well, a greater sense of personal fulfillment, inner harmony.
It's about working with these fundamental forces inside of us to create a more integrated experience of life. It's really profound.
Well, as we come to the end of this deep dive, this exploration of the principle of gender, it feels like the perfect time to step back for a minute. Let's recap our journey through all of these principles. It's been quite a ride,
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. Over these discussions, we've explored all 7 of these Hermetic principles, and each one has given us a unique perspective on how the universe works and how we fit into it.
We started with mentalism, that fundamental idea that everything starts in the mind, that our thoughts shape our reality.
Then we explored correspondence, that powerful idea of as above, so below. how patterns and principles repeat at every level of existence, from the cosmos to our personal lives.
We learn about vibration, the idea that everything is in constant motion, vibrating at different frequencies, and by raising our own vibration, we can align ourselves with more positive states.
Polarity taught us about the duality in everything and how seemingly opposing forces are often just two sides of the same coin.
We talked about rhythm, the cyclical nature of life, the ebb and flow, the importance of understanding and working with those natural rhythms.
And cause and effect, that nothing happens randomly, that every action has consequences, and by understanding the causes, we can influence the effects in our lives.
And now we've come full circle to the principle of gender, highlighting the presence of masculine and feminine energies in all of creation. It emphasizes that balance, that interplay between these forces. It's crucial for creation and harmony.
As you wrap up this part of your journey with these amazing sources, think about how these 7 principles resonate with you. How can you integrate these understandings? How can you cultivate balance, foster your own growth, and navigate your life with more awareness?
Such a great question to ponder. And as we conclude this deep dive, one last thought for you to chew on. Understanding this principle, it's not just about achieving personal balance, it's about recognizing those fundamental creative forces at work in the universe itself. See if you can observe these masculine and feminine dynamics, not just in yourself, but in nature, in your relationships, even in those subtle shifts within your own mind.
A truly profound reflection to leave with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into these timeless concepts. It's been a pleasure sharing this exploration with you.